And people who are just joining us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's great to see where people are joining us from. Got Alice from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Kathy from Knoxville. So cool. Hi, Elaine. Hi, Susan.
Oh.
Give people one more minute.
All over.
Carol, hi. Hi, Emily. Hi, Renee, Gina, Nancy, Lisa, Laura, Miriam. Everyone's coming in so fast, I can barely capture everybody.
Right. Welcome, welcome.
That's awesome.
Oh, the UP, Michigan.
I'm imagining if when we went to in-person events, we all just like shouted at the door, like, Lex from Providence. That's the equivalent to this. I think.
Exactly. We all, suddenly everybody has so much like local pride.
Yeah.
It's great to see everybody. Well, welcome everybody. We've got like 160 people here so far, and people are still coming in. It's wonderful to be together. I'm Judith Rosenbaum, the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, and you're here with the Quarantine Book Club hosted by JWA and JewishLIVE. Thank you for joining us. Lex, do you want to?
Yeah, so it's a thrill to be here. The Quarantine Book Club is becoming very quickly, has already become a fun highlight of my weeks. Thanks to all of you who are now frequent flyers of the Quarantine Book Club. I hope you've been purchasing the books and reading them. We've got an incredible, I don't know if you call this episode, conversation, video, whatever this is, it's going to be an incredible one tonight with Anna Salomon on Book of V. As a reminder, JewishLIVE is an organization, a project that launched just a couple months ago, and we just topped 20 weekly programs that we offer, with this one being one of them, the Quarantine Book Club. But if you're curious to find out what other weekly programs JewishLIVE is offering for you to engage in as we are all in this challenging moment of COVID-19, you can check all those programs out at jewishlive.org/on-demand. We've got programs pretty much every day of the week, multiple on some days of the week, and it's really been a joy to just participate myself as a listener and learner. So we hope that you will tune in. But now I'm going to pass back to JWA and Judith Rosenbaum for an awesome conversation tonight.
Thank you, Lex. And for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to explore JWA, we are a digital archive that works to expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We try to draw on the richness of our history for insight about the world today. I hope you'll check out jwa.org. This is just one of many projects and resources that we offer, all free and available on our site, so check it out. One moment of logistics before I introduce Anna. We would love for people to introduce themselves in the chat box, as you can see, and also please ask your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them in the course of our conversation. I'll weave them in. So I'd love to hear, and I know Anna would too, love to hear your questions. And we look forward to including your voices in the conversation, even though we are not able to include your actual voice or face, but I love the intimacy that we've been able to create together nonetheless. So I am delighted to introduce Anna Salomon, who is the author of 3 novels, all excellent: The Book of V, which we'll be talking about tonight, Leaving Lucy Pear, and The Little Bride. She's also a 2-time winner of the Pushcart Prize, and her short fiction and essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, in Plowshares, and many other places, too long to list. She's co-editor with Eleanor Henderson of Labor Day, True Birth Stories by Today's Best Women Writers. And she's a graduate of Brown University and the Iowa Writers Workshop, and teaches writing at many places, including Barnard and the Warren Wilson's MFA program in creative writing. Anna usually lives in Brooklyn, but right now she and her family are sheltering in Gloucester, where she grew up. So that's where she joins us from tonight. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor to be here. And thank you to JewishLIVE. Thank you to the Jewish Women's Archive. I've used the Jewish Women's Archive with all of my books at this point in the research process. So I really am just incredibly grateful for the resources that you guys provide.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I mean, I've loved your books, but that's been an added pleasure of reading your books, is finding the little hints of things where I'm like, hey, I know where that came from.
Yeah.
So The Book of V, which just came out last week. So I have to admit, I only finished reading it the beginning of this week, and I just loved it. It is an exploration, a rewriting of the Book of Esther. So let's start there. Why the Book of Esther? How did you come to this particular project?
So I have always been fascinated since I was a little girl with sort of the mystery of what happened to Vashti. That it is just this sort of blank spot, this absence, if you will, in the Purim story. And I was sort of fascinated by how she was always portrayed as, clearly she was bad, but it was not clear to me exactly what made her bad. And Esther was good. Esther was clearly the heroine. She was the one we were supposed to dress up as girls. And I just wanted to know more about her. And so this book began as sort of an exploration in that direction. And it became much bigger than that, in the sense that I decided to play with, I decided that I really wanted to explore not just one timeline, but to really look at how women's lives have and have not changed over time, and the ways in which the stories we tell about women's lives have and have not changed, and how those stories shape us. And so I decided to really get playful with this and sort of put my Vashti character, transpose her, if you will, sort of into 1970s Washington, D.C., to have an Esther type character, a second wife in contemporary Brooklyn. And then to also be telling the story in ancient Persia of really how the Book of Esther came to be. To be clear, not sort of the definitive version, because nobody knows, but my own imagined version.
And which one did you start writing of those three narratives?
I started with Vivian Barr in 1973, Washington, D.C. She, who is my Vashti, the book of V. There are all these different V's. There is Vashti, there is Vivian, and there's also a Vera. But she goes by V as in VEE. That's her nickname. And so that's where I started writing.
And why Watergate? Why that particular setting? And maybe this is a good time to read a little bit of how you set the stage for V.
Okay, so let me read. This is going to be, I'm going to read very briefly, I should say, to everybody. Go ahead, Judith. Did you?
No, go.
Want to add something?
I was just going to say,
okay.
unless you wanted to say something about Watergate first, but I think read first, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think everybody here who's familiar with the Book of Esther, and this isn't something I've been reading a lot, because some people need a little bit of a primer to that. I was going to assume that most people in this audience know the basics of the Book of Esther, so I'm kind of going to go ahead. But you'll feel here, you may not know the language, which is something that I didn't necessarily know until I went back to the text itself. But in these opening lines, very much sort of mimicking the language from the opening of the Book of Esther. And this is the first chapter that we meet V in, and it's called Royal Preparations. And yeah, I think I'll just read it and then I'll talk a little bit about it. But you can just pay attention to sort of what might feel familiar to you. Yeah. It happened in the days of Nixon. That Nixon who presided over 50 states from the Florida Keys to the Aleutian Islands. In those days, in the 5th year of Nixon's reign, when the scandal that would undo him was erupting in Washington and beyond, a great unspoken license was given to any official who was not he. A veil of distraction fell over the capital's swampy fortress, and a lustiness took hold, an appetite for drink and women uncommon even among that time and people. It followed that a banquet of minor scandals, insults, and crimes was enjoyed in the townhouses of powerful men. There were floor-to-ceiling drapes of heavy velvet, and there were couches of Italian leather on sheepskin rugs. The wine glasses were nearly invisible, the lowballs weighty as a man's fist. The rule for drinking was drink. Among these men was one, Senator Alexander Kent of Rhode Island, who gave no fewer than 5 parties in 1 month, displaying his home, his wife, and his good taste in Scotch. To the 5th party, which would be his last for a very long time, Senator Kent invited not only those colleagues and donors he counted among his friends, but also one man who was obscure in the capital, but famous in Rhode Island for the suitcase manufacturing empire his family had built. He invited this man to address a quickly spreading rumor he hoped to learn was untrue, that Suitcase Man was planning to endorse Kent's opponent in the following year's election. And so to the fifth party, the senator added a live band, Rhode Island scallops and little neck clams on the half shell, as well as a conceptual twist. A second concurrent party upstairs for the women only. You probably recognize this. His reasoning, as he told it to his wife, was that such an arrangement would feel at once traditional yet fresh, old yet new, comfortable yet enticing, and would give him a chance to talk plainly to Suitcase Man. His other reasoning he did not tell his wife. It happened that once upon another time, he had known Suitcase Man's wife. Senator Kent's wife, V, born Vivian Barr, daughter of the late Senator Barr of Massachusetts and granddaughter to Governor Fitz of Connecticut, as well as great-granddaughter to a soft-spoken but effective suffragette, all of whom, though dead, would be helping to pay for the party, protested. Weren't separate events antithetical to the spirit of the Equal Rights Amendment, which Rhode Island ratified 1 year ago and which Senator Kent claims in his official platform to support? A sound enough question. The senator had responded by giving her a foot massage, a rare offering, and V had yielded. And so in the year 1973, on the second day of November, a day as mild as June, Senator Kent returns from his affairs of state to find the house crawling with caterers and cleaners, bartenders and a flower arranger, and deeper still, in the kitchen, all the old noble townhouses of Georgetown had their kitchens in the deep, dark backs, his wife on her hands and knees, working at a spill with a ragged beach towel. So I'll stop there, but that's where we meet V, who becomes one of the main characters of the book.
Great. And I love how you have all the details of Washington in the language of, the setting the stage with the language of the Book of Esther itself.
Yeah, that was really fun to play with. And I mean, that's not how the book doesn't continue with sort of like biblical cadence in that way, but I wanted to establish it and play with it in that way.
Right, and draw that parallel, which comes across very well right there. You start that story and you have a sense of who V is going to be. So you're waiting for her downfall.
Yeah.
So why put her story in the 70s and in the Watergate era?
Well, so I think I began with it very clearly in the 70s, and it was later. So I'll get to that, why I said it specifically in that moment. But I started with, I was born in the late 1970s, and I was born at a moment that I think, I didn't know this then, but I think seemed to promise a lot of those of us who were being born then, that somehow sort of equality was now won. And we had, we were in a sort of now a post-feminist era. This was certainly the era about me in the 90s and the early aughts. When I was coming of age. And, as anybody sort of who sees what's happening in the world and saw it for a long time knows this is not the case. But I was interested in sort of the story that got told and the way in which when I did myself come to be a mother and a wife, I found that a lot less seemed to have changed in my experience of those experiences than seemed to have been promised would have changed. And this is how it seemed for most of the women that I know and talk to all the time about these things. So I was interested in that and sort of setting this in sort of the throes of the second wave women's movement, when there were a lot of, and Vivian Barr is a character who is sort of right at this split. So she's very much herself bound to these conventions around what it means to be a senator's wife and to come from the heritage that she comes from. But she's also sort of begun dabbling with this women's group, the sort of a women's liberation group. And she has this very, very important to her, this kind of urge inside that she doesn't even know how to articulate to herself, not to have children, which sort of goes against everything that's been expected of her. So I wanted to place her there in this moment and give her Vashti's fate in a way and see what would happen for her. And it wasn't really, I think, until honestly after the 2016 election, I had started this book before then, that Watergate really came into focus for me. And the question of and sort of, in an almost unfortunately clear way, the abuse of power, here, right here, the seat of power, powerful men, obviously the impeachment is, a piece of that as well. But the focus kind of came as both I wrote and as world events happened.
I wondered about that, sort of whether there was a sense of using the moment of Watergate as a way to comment on our current political time without having to actually do that. Because the other thing was interesting to me in that regard is that the contemporary story of Lily, the mother and second wife in Brooklyn, is happening in 2016, but before the election. There's one mention of Trump, and it's just as a kind of the entertainment of the ridiculousness of his campaign.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it was important to me that the reader would experience the characters then, experience their naivete, and have a distance from it in that way. In the same way, I was thinking it's a very, very different book, but that amazing book by Jesmyn Ward called Salvage the Bones about Hurricane Katrina. And as you read it, you know right where they're heading, and they don't. And I wanted to kind of create that same feeling for a reader of like, oh, these people have no clue what's in store for them.
Right. And what about the Me Too movement, which seems also so relevant to your book and obviously was unfolding as you were writing it? How were you thinking about did that change anything for you about how you were writing or telling the story?
It didn't change all that much. I think what it changed a little bit of, are you hearing me okay, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. I think what it changed was that people I had read the book and who read the parts around Vivian Barr going through this experience of being asked to undress in front of her husband, which is what happens. I mean, I'm not, this is not spoiling anything because it happens early in the book. And also we all know sort of the story of Esther and of Vashti. There was a lot more sort of like, well, I don't really know if this would happen. Like, I can't really, would anybody really do that to their wife? Would anyone? And it was really interesting because people stopped having that question at a certain point.
Interesting.
So that was, I think, probably the biggest shift from my perspective.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think also, the truth is that scene in some ways turns on the fact that Suitcase Man's wife, who Alex Kent has known before, he knew her in a way in which she felt that he had violated her in some way. That kind of comes out in that story. And that's sort of why there's this tension, this political tension, right? So there's a kind of key there as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, his whole problem actually comes out of his own actions previously, which he knows about, but he doesn't. Yeah.
So you get the sense that there are these Me Too stories sort of baked in ways that don't get explored fully, but are just kind of part of the, part of the action.
Totally.
So as you were writing this and thinking about how to fill in kind of the absence of Vashti and unpack the story, were you reading? I mean, obviously you went back to the original book of Esther because you wanted to kind of follow some of that through, but also were you reading kind of Midrash on Esther? And I guess my related question is, do you see your book as Midrash on Esther?
So yes, I was reading a lot of Midrash. I mean, one of the first things I did was sort of go to my rabbi and say, like, how do you find Midrash? Like, how does this work? I am not a scholar, and I'm not particularly learned at all in Jewish text. And so I know what I know from having gone to Hebrew school and becoming bat mitzvah, but I don't, in terms of like where you go to find out these things, I really didn't know. And she walked me through that. And I also took a great class with at Drisha, the Drisha Institute in New York City, around sort of writing out of biblical texts. And so it got me started in that vein and reading different interpretations and reading, over thousands of years, really, really different ideas of what might have happened. And also just, I think I really enjoyed the riffs on the story, like the ways in which Midrash just plays with, it's like, oh, and then Haman has a daughter in this story, and she, like there's just amazing creativity in those pieces. And yeah, I do see the book definitely as a work of Midrash. Absolutely, sort of my own contribution.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And in fact, your story ends in some ways with, not that I'm going to give away anything at the end, but Lily has a kind of, she gets to play with Midrash on the Purim story at the end as well, which I really loved.
Absolutely. Yeah, and all of the women in the book, without giving, it doesn't really give anything away to say that they're all sort of coming toward, by the end, finding a way to tell their own story and to narrate it in a way where they're sort of taking charge of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that was part of what I think was one of the things that I really loved about the way that you talk about power here. There are so many different levels of power that you're dealing with in the story. Some that have to do with sort of the more obvious things around, sex, around relationships with men, around politics. But there are also kind of ways that shame figures in there, or that the kind of gap in expectations. Like one of the lines about the figure of Lily that I love so much is that I think is sort of towards the beginning of meeting Lily is she says, or you say of her, Lily has not become the type of woman she was supposed to be. And I just love that, because I feel like who doesn't feel like in some ways there's some gap between who they thought they were going to be and the life that they're actually living. And I think that's true of all the main characters. They're sort of looking at their lives and being like, how exactly did I end up here? So, I think that sort of that question around how do you, like, what agency do you have to fill that gap, I guess is what I'm saying. And sort of where does storytelling fit into that?
Right. Yeah, I think that really is the journey that they're all on, right? They're like, wait a second, I was told a story of who I would be, and it doesn't turn out to be the story that I'm living. And that feels, there is shame in that gap, like you're describing. There's a feeling of like, what's wrong with me? And what they're seeking to do is figure out how to live their life in a way that feels true to them, and sort of integrate themselves with a story that actually reflects the reality. And I think that's, as a writer, I love this because it sort of, highlights just the power that stories do have over us, right? Like what the stories that we read, the stories that we see, the images that we see, the ways in which we all know this, right? This is how we come to understand ourselves and our place in the world. And if those, often when those don't match up with what we're actually experiencing, there's a tremendous, I think, loss in that. And I think it can lead to a lot of shame.
But I think also there's a way. Sorry, go ahead. I feel like we have a slight lapse in timing.
I was just going to say, and in the inverse, just to leave it in a more hopeful place, there's a power that comes with claiming one's own story and sort of being forthright, I think, with oneself about what that story is.
Yeah. Right. But I think too often that's sort of presented as like fully, like only empowering to be able to write your own story or make your own choices or whatever. And part of what I really appreciated is that you showed also the vulnerability that comes with that. And there was a place when Lily's talking about her mother and kind of the realization she has about her mother, about her realizing that her mother had to kind of assemble herself and therefore felt fragile in some ways. And I love that so much, because I think, like, of course, there is something amazing about assembling yourself, right? It's an act of kind of self-creation, but also recognizing that means that, you might be a little rickety or whatever goes along with the act of self-assemblage.
Right. Totally. And also, I think that the people that we've watched, right, whether they're our mothers or they're storytellers or they're celebrities or whoever, that they, that recognition of, like, you see them as sort of this monument, as a finished person, and in the recognition that they are in fact assembled, right, and still in the act of assembly. There is, I think, a lot of there is a lot of vulnerability in that, but I also think this sort of opportunity for tenderness toward those people and toward oneself.
Yes, it's so relevant in this age of, social media and fake booking. I feel like I'm constantly saying to my kids, like, don't compare your insides to someone else's outsides. But it is hard to remember even for grownups.
Totally.
And I think that gets at another piece that I really appreciated that you kind of explored, which is about power as it relates to women's relationships to other women. And both in terms of friendship, in terms of competition, in terms of, there's consciousness raising groups here, there's a harem. Were you trying, was that part of your kind of equation of figuring out the power dynamics here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The book is so much, and it's interesting. I've been reading a lot from this one section of Lily early on, and someone was pointing out to me how many times I use the word group and tribe in this scene. It's like a scene of a sewing party, but the women here, the book is very much about the ways in which women build our friendships with each other, love each other, connect with each other, compete with each other, judge each other. And I see it as sort of an arc toward an opening toward each other, toward like those softer places. But also sort of really a reckoning with the ways in which it's just built, like in which we're taught, partly in the stories that we're told, like good, bad, wanton, virtuous, that there are types of women. And so what type of women will I be? And there's a line in the book, I think we talked about this, that, the type of woman she imagined herself becoming does not exist. That line, and that's been a line that's been striking a chord for a lot of readers, I think, because that really gets at that core sort of project of the book and of what I was trying to explore. And in this, you just remind me of it when you were talking about fake book. I just wanted to mention, because I don't know if I told you about this, but I've been actually, along with publishing this book, I had started sort of in this vein, this Instagram called Unkempt that collects photographs of women's spaces. This is now, like, people are constantly submitting photos to me in like what they really look like, women's domestic spaces, like not curated and tidied up for social media, not going in the Real Simple magazine, but like after your kids have been running around the living room for half an hour, or, like whatever it is. And so that's been a real joy, because people have taken so much comfort in it. Like constantly hearing from people like, this just makes me feel so much better about myself. So that, I think, is like, a sort of manifestation of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I definitely want to follow that. And I have plenty of things to submit to that too. I posted on Instagram the other day a picture of what was left when my dog decided to eat a copy of the New Yorker while I was on the phone, which was happening in front of me. I was on a work call, and just sort of made the calculation like, well, I need to be on this call, so I'm just going to allow this complete destroying of the New Yorker. I looked to see what issue it was. It was from December. I figured that was my fault for not having read the December issue yet. that was the enactment of my shame, was that it was going to be destroyed by the dog. But and there was just like paper everywhere, and I was like, yep, this is what it looks like when I'm done with a meeting. We have some good questions here that I'd love to draw in. On the topic of midrash, Harriet is interested in knowing about sort of how you related to feminist midrash versus more traditional midrash, and which ones did you find more kind of useful, and how did they work differently in your kind of studying?
So I read a lot of both, and I sort of tried to familiarize myself also with the history of sort of the trends in midrash over time toward this book. I can't pull it out of my mind right now, but it's like the Babylonian rabbis tended to believe this about, and mostly I was looking at the book as a whole, but I was really kind of, a lot of it was honing in on Vashti herself and the way that she had been interpreted and portrayed, and whether she was seen as a leper possibly, or a prostitute, or maybe she had had some kind of disease. And then the points in history where some people had sort of stood up and been like, well, maybe she was actually doing something noble. And one very interesting, that actually one of the epigraphs for the book is from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an early American feminist who sort of thinks of her as, who talks about, and in her book, A Woman's Bible, the view of her is very much as virtuous, and having been very brave in some of the same ways that I had been brought up to see Esther as. But the other thing that she says in that book, or in that quote, is she refers to the historian as being the author. The epigraph is specifically, let me just read it because that'll be better than me. I've always regretted that the historian allowed Vashti to drop out of sight so suddenly. And one thing that led me to, and when I started reading more Midrash and also more recent, I'm trying to think the specific translation I used, Adele Berlin, that's who wrote it, who's a really, really wonderful writer. That it led me to understand was that for a long time, and obviously there are people who see this now still as a history, right? Like this is, that the book of Esther is, all of us come to faith in a different way. But that for a long time, it had been seen as a work of history about ancient Persia. And when you go and look up and try to figure out, like, what was it like for Jews in ancient Persia, everything leads you back to the Book of Esther. Like that's the source that everybody's using. And so what I was really excited to find as I got especially closer to the present in my reading was the idea, and Adele Berlin writes really, really well about this, that this is a, this is, and I know what I'm saying may be controversial to some people, but the way she sees it and the way I chose to see it was as a work of fiction. And it's a work of literature, and you can see it as a very early novel itself. There's a lot of farcical elements in it. It's very much written to stereotype Persians in a very negative way, and to create a holiday, Purim, which celebrates the Jews. And, it's a funny story. And there are many plot holes and, like none of it. But at the same time, and this is what was so interesting, the language, which is in what you could hear a little in what I read, is very much, it's posed to sound like a history. So there's all this language about the annals of the annals and the records and the edicts. And so there's all this very official language. And what Adele Berlin really breaks down the ways in which that language itself is part of the narrative voice, made to make it feel as if it's posing as history, right? Or as if it is history. Anyway, right. So that was part of what I got very excited by, all of that. And it was very fun as a novelist I just took a lot of license with it, like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna play with this.
Right, and you get to have someone else write the story. I mean, the story is ultimately, in your version, slight spoiler, like written by Vashti, basically, not by Mordecai or whoever is sort of the.
Let's not go into that more now.
Right. We have a question about writing historical fiction, and I had questions for you about this too, because your two previous novels are like all historical fiction. This one, you have a kind of more imaginary biblical piece, a historical thread, and then a contemporary thread. So I want to ask you about what it was like to write the contemporary thread, but first we can answer the question about what, writing historical fiction, how do you go about it? How do you balance that question between sort of the history and fiction piece? Tell us a little bit about your process.
So in all of my books, the approach that I've taken is I really do once I sort of have a clear idea of the story that I want to write, the overall story, I really start writing and researching in tandem. So I do a ton of research, but I don't, there are, and every writer would give you a different answer to this. There are there are writers who spend a year or two just doing the research and then they start to write. And there are people who just write and then they figure it out later. I feel like I don't want to get in a place where the research paralyzes the story, and I want the research to be driven by the story. Like I want to find out what the story needs me to know, instead of sort of being so overwhelmed with details that they often can sort of detract from the story. And when I teach historical fiction writing, a lot of people who are starting to write historical fiction, there's a lot that you want to include because it's great. Like, oh my God, but I learned this and I learned that. And one danger, I think, in doing like all the research up front is that you're sort of you're overstuffing instead of really listening to what the story and the characters, getting to know the characters as well. So it's a sort of symbiotic for me.
Hmm. And so what was it like to kind of switch gears and write a contemporary character? Did it feel very different, or did it feel sort of the same?
It did. I mean, it was interesting. It felt different in that I really hadn't written a character before who was so close to sort of my trappings and my point in my stage in life. And also the culture that I live in terms of, Park Slope, Brooklyn, and this whole, so it was very fun to kind of feel like I could kind of comment on that and be silly about it. And, a little bit mocking in certain ways, but it's not mocking. It's just that I have a sense of humor about it, I guess. And that was really fun. And then it turned out, of course, that like I needed to do research about that too. There was this whole, a lot of it got cut, but there was more about, there is in the book still this sort of subplot around an aquaculture project in a Rwandan fish camp. And like, there are things that come up in a story, even when it takes place, in the here and now, that still require a lot of research. So.
Right. That makes sense. I appreciated that the Lily character didn't feel like a caricature, which I think is very easy to do when writing about mothers in Brooklyn. Yeah. And I feel like I've read a lot of novels that have characters that are sort of the same general biography as Lily, and some of the same themes around you know, being sort of like the choices that I've made and how do I really feel about them. But often it feels like it's at the expense of the character, or the character is somehow mocked in a way or not taken seriously in a way that maybe has to do more with, maybe does have to do with that exactly what you're writing about, that sense of like shame and how much you can take yourself seriously. But I loved that Lily didn't feel that way.
Yeah.
And, you know, felt like someone who was a more fully fleshed out, who you could, you know, who wasn't perfect and you could see her flaws, but you also, you weren't meant to laugh at her.
Totally. No, I'm glad that you said that. I mean, I want her to be, I mean, all my characters, like, you know, they're all flawed, and I want you to be able to see that, but still have this fundamental deep respect for them, as, you know, that the reader feels toward them, and is not in some way sort of above them, but really with them. Yeah.
Do you want to read a little piece of Lily?
Sure. Yeah. I'll read like even just a little paragraph here just to give a flavor. This is early on in the book, and I think gives a little bit of a flavor of her with the, well, you'll see her daughters have been, so she has decided kind of against her will, but that she's going to learn to sew costumes for her daughters for the holiday of Purim. And her daughters have been obsessed with this children's version of the Book of Esther that her mother gave to them. And she is so tired of reading this book to them on a number of levels that the day before she actually like threw it out, the day before this scene. So this is, again, it's just a paragraph. And one of her daughters here you'll see is June. Lily finds June standing on the couch, holding the Book of Esther above her head like a trophy. Lily snatches the book away. Her attempt the previous night to throw it out was thwarted by the building's porter, who, having found it in the trash, knocked on their door this morning, cheerful, in his blue jumpsuit. One of your girls make a mistake. Lily wanted to scream. She hates the book, and not only because her mother gave it to the girls in her pushy, be more Jewish way, or because the girls quickly grew obsessed with it. She hates the book because after going through 3 stages with it herself, she was entertained briefly, then bored, then bewildered. She has entered a 4th stage in which she recognizes that the embattled Queen Esther, like Lily, is a second wife. Lily drops the book into the dark crevasse behind the couch cushions. And then she goes on with her day and goes to the sewing party and so on. But you can get a feeling there, I think, a little bit of Lily's complexity and her mix of, you know, Lily's somebody who, for most every thought she has, she sort of has a thought about that thought. I guess that's what we call neurosis, right?
I don't know. I was like, that sounds normal to me.
I know. Me too.
I thought it was funny though that she sort of hates the story of Esther, because I wondered if that was like your, you know, sort of alter ego that's like, oh, I'm kind of starting to hate this story, but I'm committed to writing this book, so now I have to live with the story of Esther for so long, even though it is bewildering and maddening in some ways.
Yeah, no, I didn't feel that way about writing this book. I actually loved writing this book, but I did feel that way about the children's version of the Book of Esther that we got in our household. Which mostly just because I thought that I understood the Book of Esther. And then I was like, this makes no sense. And like for, you know, just among the many, you know, it's like, oh, Ahasuerus seems really innocent, but like he told him to kill the Jews, but now he seems to not know that he did. Like, what's going, there's like so much in the book that makes no sense at all. And so, yeah, I did find it like, just, oh my God. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to go in here and find out what's what, or create what's what.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing. I feel like actually, at least at my synagogue, it feels like the celebration of Purim has actually like really changed since the Me Too movement. It's like all of a sudden people noticed what the story was actually about and were like, oh, this isn't funny, you know? And we actually have started having a talk before the Megillah reading that's like about, you know, women and violence and stuff like that. So it's been a very interesting kind of reframe that I think sort of the context suddenly help people see it differently. Absolutely. Yeah. I've been talking with various people about that too. I think it is time to have new conversations about it. Yeah. Did this project whet your appetite for writing more biblical stories? I see that Penny is suggesting that you write a book on Hagar as your next project. I don't know.
no. I mean, the book that I'm sort of dabbling in now is not one. It's not another one. I could definitely see doing it again if one grabbed my interest. But as of now, it's not sort of the next plan.
What are you working on now?
Hagar is an amazing character that I have a lot of questions about.
That she is definitely another one of those.
A novel about Hagar? Maybe I should write that novel.
Yeah, I've definitely read tons of midrash, some of which is fictional, but I can't think of a novel about her.
Yeah. I can also think of nonfiction books, but well, Penny, you'll make it into my acknowledgments if that book comes to pass. Thank you.
Can I ask what the project you're working on now is?
I mean, you can. I don't. It's so nascent that I can't really speak of it, except that it's, actually also about sort of a woman from the news from about 20 years ago who sort of has disappeared. And I'm interested in writing about her a few years from now, sort of telling the story of where she's gone. So I guess maybe I'm writing the same book again.
Interesting.
I think it'll be very different.
And we have a question about, again, on the kind of historical novelist piece. Do you have particular influences or muses that turned you onto the genre or inspire you to write historical fiction?
I probably shouldn't say this. I'm not a huge reader of historical fiction. I mean, I do read it, and there are some books that I love. I think maybe my favorite book of historical fiction is The Known World by Edward P. Jones. Amazing book set during in the South around Black slaves and Black slave owners. And it's an incredibly sort of kaleidoscopic, incredible book. I also, but I think that I draw, and I think I know that's part of my approach to writing the fiction too, is sort of one that comes first at it from story before I come at it as, I don't think in the genre of I'm writing historical fiction. It turns out that that's what I'm doing, but it's not kind of the way that I come at it. For this book, probably my greatest influence, which does have some historical fiction is Michael Cunningham's The Hours, also a book about three women's interlocking stories evolving from a book, the Mrs. Dalloway in that case. And so that was a real inspiration for me structurally, especially because as I was coming up with this book, it was sort of gave me the courage to do it and figure out kind of how I could make these three stories weave together. I also see the mention of Geraldine Brooks, who is a writer whose work I love. And there are many historical works that I love. I just don't feel like I've read as widely in the genre in a way as I have in others.
How did you do the writing of the three pieces? Like, did you focus on one character and kind of write out their narrative and then figure out how to weave them together? Or were you writing kind of the chunks of different stories as you went along?
I wrote them in the order that they appear. So I wrote them as, from one to the next. And for me, it was the only way to do it, because I wanted to write it in the order that the reader would experience it. And I wanted there to be, there's the plot that goes on. And then there's also a lot of objects and gestures and sounds and symbols that that are woven throughout. And it wasn't as if in the first draft they were all there perfectly, but I was conscious of them from the start. So the only thing that was written out of order is actually the very first chapter, which is, I think of as sort of a preface, which is just Lily kind of talking to her kids about the book about this children's book. And that was sort of a latter addition in the sense of trying to make sure that readers who had no background in the Book of Esther had access to the book.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It also serves as kind of a warning in some way, because doesn't it start with close the book?
Yes, it does. Do you have any memory of this golden book, the Sesame Street golden book? Do you remember
Grover?
this? With Grover, who's like saying, don't keep, and I was thinking about that when I wrote that chapter, actually. It came back because I love that book.
I love the book, the monster at the end of the book. I love that book. Yeah.
He's just like, stop, don't read this book. And then of course he turns out to be a monster. Sorry if I'm giving it away for those of you who are still.
I don't think there's any Grover spoilers left. one question I had about the Esther piece, we haven't talked about the Esther piece that much. I mean, there were a lot of questions I had about it, actually. One is that you introduce magic into that story. And famously, the Book of Esther doesn't have God in it, right? So there sort of is no like external powers that are controlling the story. And yet in your version of the story, you have this kind of magical force and goblins and stuff. So I was curious about your choice to introduce that element into it.
Yeah, it was, it happened sort of organically at first. Like that goblin was the begin. Like there was this goblin, and then the goblin actually causes the problem for the people in my version of the story, because he spits up these false coins, which cause trouble. And as soon as I sort of had the goblin, I was like, everybody in this world doesn't seem to think that there's anything strange about the goblin. Like they all accept the goblin. Maybe there's something else going on here. And so kind of naturally, I came to, develop this, like that some of the people have magical powers, and Esther herself is sort of descended from people who do, but doesn't know that she contains any herself. And part of her project is to figure out whether she does, and to figure out if she can harness some of them in her own journey. And that was really, really fun to write. I have not written that kind of sort of fantasy before. And I think what happened as I was doing is many things, but it gave me this whole other way to explore power in that part of the book. And I think also to connect her, it connected for me a little bit too with Lily's daughters and their love of the Book of Esther, and like the way that they experience it in a much more magical way than I think adults do. And it also was a real signal. I wanted to make it very clear to my readers that I was not trying to create a sort of definitive, like, I'm going to tell you what really happened in ancient Persia now. So it was an urge toward that kind of playfulness and to kind of stake that ground out and establish the terms of the story. But it wound up being a lot of fun. And I'm hearing from readers that it's a lot of fun for them too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, because it did just give it a different, I don't even know what the right word is, but it instead of sort of waiting for the story to unfold, you have this sense of like, there's a certain force to it, or I don't really have the right words for it, but it also made me wonder as I was reading other parts of the book, I was wondering if that was going to appear in some way. So like in one scene with V, where she comes across this guy in the woods, I was sort of like, is this guy real? Is there going to be some kind of like strange fantasy element here? So I was kind of curious where else it might erupt.
Yeah, that was meant to feel that way. And there is a sort of like a mention of wands at the end with Lily's daughters. That was, these are things that probably a lot of people won't even see, but there was sort of a weaving that I was doing.
So one of the things that doesn't show up in the book of Esther, the Esther part as you rewrite it, is one of the things that I think of as being kind of the centerpiece of the traditional Book of Esther, which is that it's kind of a coming out story, right? It's like the story of Esther revealing herself to be a Jew. And in your version of it, it's kind of known from the beginning that she's a Jew. That's not really a hidden piece. I mean, there's a piece where her uncle, who's called Marduk in your book, kind of says you don't have to tell them who you are. So there's a little, right, uncertainty, and certainly the Jews are not a beloved presence. So right, it's clear that it's not great, but I'm curious about that choice.
Yeah, I'm trying now to think. I mean, because she doesn't tell, I don't think that they know. I'm trying to remember. It's not clear until, I guess it's in the first scenes when she's sort of trying to work her magic. One of the key elements of this book, right, is that, or the way that I imagined that book, is that Esther does not want to become queen. And so I think she's not interested in hiding any information about herself that might keep her from being queen, because she would like for that information to be out there. But I also invented a very different kind of harem than I think the one that is the sort of flatter one that's in the Book of Esther itself. And it's actually a very ethnically diverse harem, and there are girls from all over. And one of the things about this harem is that it turns out, as I imagined it would be, that actually these are not like Esther's not the only one who's an orphan. Like most of these girls are not from families of any stature or money or power. And that's why they're there. Because, and this is part of what we were saying, like, I think people are coming even in the last couple of years to sort of understand the book of Esther differently and be like, like, okay, let's talk about violence. Let's talk about trafficking. Let's talk about like all of these things that are happening here. And so I guess in that way, I am kind of suggesting another way of understanding that scene, so to speak, like what was happening there. And that I don't know that it would have been such a big deal for her to be like her being, but I mean, that's a very different interpretation of the story, right? Because so it is different. It is different. But it isn't the crux of her. It isn't the crux of her issue.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the other things that was notable, which someone else mentioned, is you don't ever name Haman, which is such an interesting thing because, first of all, in the celebration of Purim, like the mentioning of his name is such a piece of the festivity because you're drowning it out, right? So there's like such a presence of his name in that you're trying to drown it out. But then also just in terms of the kind of gender politics of this, it felt so interesting to me as a historian who's often reading things and wishing that the women were named in history and aren't. It felt like such an interesting reversal to be like the man he's a key figure he's an important sort of minister or whatever, but his name is erased.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he really is, he's reduced to type.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like I got to do that. And that's all he is. He's the evil minister. And I do have sort of other versions of him in different parts of the story, right? So I have someone named Hump, who's the senator's evil minister. And then there's a sidekick in the Brooklyn story named Hal. So I have these other H's that run through. But yeah, I didn't want to give him a name, that Haman.
Yeah, I appreciated that. I didn't really think of Hal as an evil type.
No, he's a tricky one. Yeah. He's definitely not evil in that way. Although there was this sort of whole other plot that I had to just cut out that did where there was sort of a descending on his part into another level of evilness. But
interesting.
Yeah,
that is a whole other thing I don't think about, all the things left on the cutting room floor that could be part of the story that the reader never gets to know about.
Yeah, so much.
So one of the things that really caught my ear sort of at the end of the book, as we're hearing from Vashti, and we know that Vashti is kind of preparing to tell the story. And she says, I think she says this, or at least I am remembering this, saying something about thinking about how to tell the story that they needed to hear so it's not going to be the story of what actually happened. It's going to be the version that the Jews need to hear. So that just sort of from the, perspective of the, kind of unreliable narrator, just made me think about your project of writing and sort of how were you thinking about what is the story that the reader needs to hear? Were you thinking about like, what is the story that I need to hear, that I need to tell? Was that sort of a conscious part of your own act of authorship?
I don't know if it's consciousness so much, because I don't tend to write with an idea of like, I want to say, there's an idea that I want to get across. But I do think that so it comes out through the characters, through the fiction. But I do think that the project was one of, I think sort of saying to readers, like, look at how complex and rich and contradictory women's lives and experiences are, and let's could we move toward a place where we are less, again, I think I was saying this earlier, but like less judgmental and less because I think part of this, the whole 70s thing is that conflict that I was talking about before, is the idea that even in our liberalism and in our sort of progressivism, there can be a lot of intolerance. There can be a lot of narrowness. Lily feels judged by her mother for making the choice to stay at home with her kids. Other women, as we know, like feel judged if they don't breastfeed, or if they do, or, what could we see a way forward where we see ourselves, whatever choices we're making, as being united? I think that's sort of a central question of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. We have a question from Emily who wants to know the name of the translated version of Esther that you used.
Is it JPS? Is that right? By Adele Berlin. I can share it with you, and we can share. It's my big green hardbound book, but I think it's I want to say JPS commentary, translated by Adele Berlin.
Okay, we can look that up. And also we'll put in the chat the link for how you buy the Book of E, which I hope everyone will do. You can, of course, get it on Amazon where all things are available, or you can get it on Bookshop, which if you haven't heard of Bookshop yet, folks, it is a way to order books online through independent bookstores. You can even have it be ordered directly from your own local independent bookstore. So that's a great way to support local communities at this time when they are really struggling. It's funny to be reading this book. I was saying this at the very beginning before we started. It's funny to be reading this book, not as we're heading into Purim, but as we're heading into Shavuot. But I am anticipating that your book will have a whole new round of exciting programs to be done next March. When people are preparing for Purim.
I think that's probably true. Yeah. And the Jewish Book Council does their events, and I think a lot will happen closer to that. Maybe there will be a paperback by then, or close to one. And yeah, I think there will be a lot to talk about around Purim.
And can you tell us a little bit, we have some questions about some of your other books. Do you want to tell us just a little? I know we've mentioned them, but let's give a tiny taste of what else people can read from you.
Yes. And I also just wanted to repeat what you said just briefly as a writer, how much I think we all value the independent bookstores in our communities and want to be able to walk into them again one day. And so, I want you just to buy the book. That would be great. Buy it anywhere. But also, if it does work for you to do that, most of them are finding ways, whether it's through Bookshop, or they'll call, they're delivering books locally. There's all sorts of ways. Anyway, just a shout out to our local booksellers. So my first book, The Little Bride, is about a Jewish mail order bride from Odessa, Ukraine in the 1880s, who winds up not in New York City or Chicago as she imagined, but in South Dakota, homesteading as part of this movement, this Jewish pioneer movement called the Am Olam movement. She winds up married to a man who's much older than her, and she falls in love with one of his sons. There's the nugget. I still remember how to talk about that book. That's good. Almost 10 years now. And then my second book, Leaving Lucy Pear, is set on Cape Ann, which is where I am now, Cape Ann, Massachusetts, in the 1920s, and is about a mother, an abandoned baby, and sort of the woman who abandoned her, and then the woman who has raised her. She was abandoned by a young sort of socialite Jewish woman from or teenager really from Boston, and she's been raised in a large Irish Catholic family in Gloucester. So love it if people would check those out too. Yeah,
absolutely. And at JWA you can find stories of some of those actual homesteaders, Jewish homesteaders, in places you would not expect Jews to be, and they're fascinating stories.
Really fascinating.
Yeah, I love the stories that kind of upend our expectations about where Jews lived and what Jewish communities and families look like. And we try to do a lot of kind of expanding people's notions beyond the particular kind of stereotypes. But it's great when you get these nuggets where you're like, what? I did not hear this story growing up.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, thank you so much, Anna, for being with us tonight, for sharing the story and your process a little bit. And I know that for those of us who've already read the book, it's really exciting to get to talk to you about it. And I know that this has whet the appetite of many more who will buy the book now. So it is really wonderful to be in conversation with you again. And we look forward when you have your, no pressure, but when we will look forward to having another conversation with you about your future writing too.
Okay. Thank you so much for this. This was really, really a pleasure. Thank you.
It was really fun. And I hope for all of you who have joined us today that you enjoyed this. It is recorded. You'll be able to find it on our site, along with all the other meetings of the Quarantine Book Club. And I hope that you'll join us next week, same time, same place, for what I have come to think of as our version, JWA's version of Must See TV. for a conversation with the poet Rachel Zucker, which will be really wonderful. And then the following week, I'm very excited to say that we are going to have a special program on Wednesday, May 27th, Wednesday because Thursday night is Shavuot. At 8 p.m. on Wednesday, May 27th, we are going to be having a panel discussion about the new TV show, Mrs. America, which shares some of the same themes. It's about the fight for and against the ERA, sort of focusing on the Phyllis Schlafly story and all of the feminists who were fighting against her, many of whom are Jewish. So stay tuned for that. We have a great lineup of people to talk about that. It's an opportunity to revisit those moments of the 70s and the promise and the peril that lurked beneath the surface. And then in June, we're going to be piloting a new series on Jewish women in history, which is called Leading Through Crisis and Change, Jewish Women at the Turn of the Century. So stay tuned for that too. And then after that, we will have many more, I hope, meetings of the Quarantine Book Club. This has become such a great anchor to my week, and I hope to your weeks as well. So thank you so much for being with us. Stay healthy, everybody. Stay safe. A good night. And I will look forward to seeing you next week.